They called him dead weight before he even set foot on deck. The laughter rolled down the gangway like loose bolts, careless and metallic. Someone muttered that the old man belonged in a chair, not on a warship. He heard it all, but his silence was harder than their noise. Edward Marlowe was 84. He stood before the museum ship that had once carried his name in its log. The letters were still there, hidden beneath layers of new paint. He leaned on his cane, not for pity, but for balance against the memories pressing back. A volunteer pointed to the sign that said restricted and waved him away. The boy guarding the rope saw only age. He didn't see the stance that came from years of bracing against pressure and cold. Edward turned aside, eyes steady on the hull that used to answer his commands. The world had moved on, and he had not been invited. A couple passed, whispering that he looked familiar. He kept walking until the sound faded, leaving only the echo of his steps. Each tap of the cane was an old clock, marking a life still in motion. He stopped by the brass plaque that listed the ship's history. His finger traced where his own name should have been. The metal was cool and indifferent, as if the years had erased the need to remember. Behind him, the harbor sounded alive, but the ship's belly groaned like something half asleep. He tilted his head slightly, recognizing the tone the way a mother knows her child's cry. A sudden vibration traveled through the deck. Guests didn't notice, but Edward's hand tightened on the rail. It was the kind of tremor a hull makes when water finds a way inside. He waited for the second pulse, the confirmation that instinct was not nostalgia. It came, sharper, deeper, somewhere below. A valve failed with the weary sigh of metal surrendering. Shouts broke from the tour group, confusion more than fear. Edward didn't hesitate. He began to move. The cane hit the ground once, then he abandoned it by the gangway. Each step was deliberate, a rhythm that memory carried without effort. He passed two attendants arguing about the alarm system. Neither realized the old man understood the language of the ship better than they did. Inside the maintenance bay, light flickered over racks of stored parts. Edward scanned them as if reading an old manual line by line. Then he saw it, the diving suit. Brass helmet dulled to a patient brown. It hung like a relic waiting for confession. He reached for the straps and they resisted, stiff with time. A technician appeared, surprised, voice high and nervous. He said the gear was for display, not for use. Edward only nodded once, testing the joints with practiced hands. The young man hesitated, then fetched a wrench without being asked. Together they checked the hose connections, slow and methodical. The air smelled faintly of oil and rubber, clean in its own way. When they finished, Edward gave a small nod, approval without words. He began to dress, layer after layer, until the past felt close enough to touch. The helmet sat on the bench like a loyal animal waiting to be called. He wiped its glass with a sleeve, catching his reflection for a brief, unguarded moment. The face staring back looked calm, almost resigned. Voices outside grew louder, orders, confusion, the sound of boots on metal. The emergency klaxon began to wail, thin and late. Edward tightened the final strap and felt the weight settle on his shoulders. It was heavy, but familiar, the kind of burden a man learns to trust. He turned to the young technician. Their eyes met for a second, a bridge across years and wars. The lad opened his mouth to protest again, but Edward raised a gloved hand. The gesture was gentle, a command wrapped in grace. He checked the air valve one last time, then moved towards the hatch. Every sound around him blurred into one heartbeat, slow and exact. He tested the ladder, feeling each rung under his boots. The metal was slick but honest. A voice crackled through the intercom, asking if anyone was below. Edward didn't answer. The silence was reply enough. He pressed his palm to the wall beside the hatch, as if greeting an old friend. Then he opened it and stepped into the dark. Water met him not as an enemy, but as something that had been waiting. The first shock gave way to calm, like the moment before a prayer begins. He descended by memory, counting quietly in his head. 12 steps, then turn, then 6 more. He saw the glint of metal ahead where the valve had burst. Bubbles rose like silver seeds, frantic and alive. He reached out, slow and sure, feeling for the wheel that would stop the flow. It refused to move. He braced both hands and twisted harder, joints protesting but holding. The wheel gave a little, just enough to bleed pressure. Water hissed around him, angry at the interruption. He steadied his breathing, slow, even, learned. The lights above flickered through the water like distant stars. He looked up once, saw movement, and carried on. This was not heroism, it was habit. Duty returned from the deep. He had been many things, but never careless. A sharp noise echoed, metal surrendering somewhere beyond reach. He turned his head slightly, marking direction by vibration alone. The suit creaked, joints alive again under strain. He pressed on, calm, deliberate, unhurried. Every movement drew him deeper into the ship's forgotten veins. He worked by feel, a man stitching together what time had undone. No one saw him down there, and that suited him fine. Above, panic grew. Below, order returned in silence. He placed a hand on the bulkhead, steadying himself as the valve held. The pressure eased, the sound softened. He stayed still for a moment, listening to the hum of balance restored. Then he lifted his head and exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt the sea listen, and in that stillness, he found himself again. He pressed his brow to the rim of the helmet and steadied for what came next. He moved lower into corridors that smelled of oil and old metal, each step measured and sure. 3 men lay trapped beyond the bent bulkhead, faces set in the dull white of shock. He spoke in short, clear commands that turned panic into work. A young engineer latched onto his voice and followed without question. Edward braced at a stubborn wheel and began to ease pressure with steady hands. He showed the crew how to hold tension and then release it, a taut rhythm that spared fingers and time. When a bolt snapped, he wedged a piece of spare metal and levered a gap. Fingers cramped but faithful. The sound of metal yielding became the first small mercy of the hour. They freed a foreman caught beneath a warped plate, and he coughed as if air itself had been a surprise. No speeches were given, only practical aid passed along a human chain. A ladder trembled as people climbed, each rung reclaimed like a promise. Edward waited until the last person was safe, then began his own ascent. A strap had cut into his shoulder, and a hot pain flared, but he eased another man's lifeline first. The technician cursed softly, and Edward answered with a clipped direction that steadied him. Hands moved with the quiet competence of repeated drills, gratitude expressed in small actions. A jacket was wrapped about a shivering man, water ladled out in careful cups. Reports crackled over a radio, voices trying to turn chaos into order. A junior officer who had earlier barred him now offered bandages and an awkward apology. Edward accepted help without comment, preferring to mend pipes rather than speak of wrongs. He checked a damp log and found a folded note tucked between pages. Ink blurred by water. The paper contained a single line that pulled at a long seam of silence, a name tied to a date. He slid it into an inner pocket, the paper warm from being handled, and said nothing. They patched a corroded clamp and spliced a cable, work by work, undoing the ship's wounds. Edward taught a young diver to tie a splice properly, his hands guiding the boys with a patience that read as authority. In a dim corner, a woman held a child and watched him with an expression that mixed relief and wonder. The child copied the shape of his gloved fingers and giggled, the small sound loosening tense faces. Edward allowed himself a brief nod, then returned to checking gauges and seals. The crew moved like a single, quiet machine, each action a stitch mending something torn. They pried open a stuck hatch, and the rush that followed felt like the clearing of a throat. The hiss of escaping pressure retreated, giving room for measured breaths. Someone hummed, a small ridiculous tune that snuck through the damp air and made people grin. It felt less like rescue and more like the remaking of ordinary days. When work slowed, they gathered beneath a lamp and checks were made for cuts and shock. A medic counted pulses, while a volunteer handed out tea in trembling cups. Edward sipped and felt the warmth steady him in a manner words could not. He listened to reports and offered short, practical corrections, no long accounts. The technician who had doubted him watched with a new curiosity and asked about the valves. Edward said quietly that some noises have pattern, as readable as a chart. The boy mimed a turning page and grinned, a manual formed in the head by watching hands. They talked in tools and motions. Praise arrived in thorough gestures, not speeches. A junior crew member produced a damp, folded sheet and pushed it toward him with careful hands. Edward unfolded it, and his eyes passed over ink that had blurred but still held a plea. He folded the paper back and slid it into an inner pocket, keeping the line like an ember. Recognition moved through the room as names were matched to faces and dates, a small unburying. The officer who had mocked him cleared his throat and said the name aloud, voice rough with effort. People listened, and a low, shared intake flowed through the assembled group. No one patted him on the back. Instead, they organized manifests and promised to search older records. Small civic acts began to sow a worn seam. A volunteer offered to keep watch over his belongings and to fetch anything he might need. Edward accepted the offer like one would accept a sensible tool, nothing performative. He sat and let exhaustion press the heat of the lamp into his joints, paper heavy in his pocket. When conversation softened, he closed his eyes briefly and let the feeling of usefulness carry him into a nap. A young technician promised to comb the manifests himself. Voice firm, Edward nodded, accepting the small pledge. He slept with the folded paper like a quiet compass. He rose when he chose, prepared for whatever would come with the dawn, carrying a folded truth against his chest. He woke to the low hum of feet and voices, and the lamp made a small island of light on the cot. The paper in his pocket warmed under his thumb, a folded thing that had lived in damp and waiting. A nurse checked him and offered tea, and he accepted because routine steadied him more than speech. Crew gathered at a table, lists spread like nets, and a junior officer asked if anyone recognized the name. Edward kept his hand in his pocket, thumb worrying the edge until the note sat softer against the skin. They read aloud, and one line made an officer pause, the room narrowing on that single sound. An orderly asked if he would receive visitors, and he had not thought to ask for anything. When the nurse said the name of a man pulled from the flooded hold, something narrow uncoiled inside him. A uniformed visitor entered, measured in step, carrying the look of someone who had been near danger and returned. They watched each other a long beat, two halves of a sentence, finding each other again. Recognition came without spectacle, faces easing into something like relief. The visitor spoke a single familiar name, and the sound filled the room with an old shape. He produced a scrap of cloth, folded and worn, a token kept through years that lacked words. Edward took it with careful fingers, folding it back into memories that needed no grand retelling. The exchange was brief, and the touch exact. Nothing theatrical, everything true. Later, the officer who had barred him approached and offered a small, official apology. It sounded awkward and thin, but it was honest in its attempt, and that was enough. Edward accepted it without ceremony, preferring practical mending to rhetorical balm. A technician who had seen him work described the way he had handled a seized wheel, and the account moved quietly through corridors. People who kept records promised to comb old manifests and to correct what had been erased. Edward wanted no headline, only a simple entry in a ship's log that matched the life he had lived. A rescued man returned to thank him, words tripping over gratitude, and pressed a coin into his hand wrapped in cloth. The gesture felt like a small anchor, a private recompense without fuss. Edward tucked it beside the folded note and let the two tokens sit like markers on a chart. They patched the final leaks, and a calm settled where chaos had been. Practical hands smoothing the ship's wounds, A nurse bandaged a cut, and a lad offered tea that steadied his fingers. The room filled with ordinary acts that had the power to stitch time back together. The young officer who had doubted him mimed a repair, and Edward guided his hands with short corrections, teaching without grandiosity. The boy learned quickly, the new muscle remembering what older hands showed. That quiet passing of skill felt like a small repair to both of them. A clerk found a damp manifest and read a line that matched the folded note, connecting a present rescue to a past confession. They compared dates and names, and a low murmur moved through the gathered people. The discovery did not demand spectacle. It asked only for the honest work of correction. An orderly promised to file the papers and chase the old records, a modest vow that carried weight. Edward accepted the promise as he would accept a spare part, useful and necessary, not ornamental. He lay back and let his eyes close, the lamp's circle shrinking to a pinprick. A soft humming began from a corner, where a woman steadied a child, the sound small and consoling. He felt gratitude rise and then settle like ballast, steady and unobtrusive. When he slept, the folded paper lay warm and safe against his chest, a map of debts acknowledged. The visitor, after a pause, dug into his wallet and produced a yellowed scrap of cloth, careful and reverent. He told how a hand had steadied him once before, in different water and a colder dark, and how he had never forgotten the name he never knew. Edward listened, the folded paper at his chest suddenly speaking across years, and neither man needed to fill the long silence with more. The revelation moved like a tide through those present, a quiet astonishment rather than a trumpet. The visitor promised he would pursue the old records himself and aid the clerk who had offered help, turning private memory into practical action. Edward accepted the promise with a nod, a small seal on a pact that required no ceremony. They spoke in tools and motions and in tidy plans to set the log straight, not for glory, but for truth. A technician made a note to search archives, and a junior officer vowed to amend manifests where needed, modest acts that resewed history. Edward wanted no parade, only a clean line that matched the life he had given. He rose when he chose the next morning, paper and coin safe in an inner pocket, and walked with the careful pace of a man who knew his limits. He moved to meet the task of records not as a complaint, but as a practical correction, laying out where truth should stand. He carried the folded scrap and the coin like small anchors, private proofs that tides can return what they have taken. He paused on the gangway and felt the ship's weight underfoot, steady and familiar. There was no loud reclamation, only a slow writing of accounts, the sort of small justice that fits in a logbook. He stepped forward, the past acknowledged and the future a quiet, measured course. Some stories never needed applause, they only needed to be heard, quietly. If this one stayed with you, take a moment, not to share, but to remember someone who once stood still and did the right thing. We tell these stories because courage doesn't shout, it waits, it listens, it endures. This is Quiet Heroes. Stay a little longer,